everybody. We're going to start on time because we have a lot to cover and we don't even think an hour is going to be enough. So I'm Amy.
I'm Brian.
And we're from the Harrisburg Palestine Coalition. And this teach-in series, this is the final part of this segment, is Palestine 107, Gaza Genocide and Global Intifada. Brian, I just wanted to make a disclaimer that this is a bird's eye view of the past 10 months. It is in no way complete or the depth that we would want to have. Each of the bullet points on here could be its own course, essentially. So we just wanted to make that disclaimer. We also tried as best we could to humanize the events and what happened and is happening. But if this comes across a bit cold or like data-y, it is not intentional, and that would never be our intention. And every number on here is a person with a family. And so we just wanted to make that disclaimer at the beginning, just because it might seem insensitive when we're just want to make sure we cover as much as we possibly can for you all and for things that you might want to learn more about. Did you have anything to add to that?
Just as part of that, sorry that I'm going to be reading straight from my notes, but it's the only way that I can touch on all the points that I'm talking on in time. So I'll just be reading straight from mine, and Amy may do the same.
Yes. Please bear with us. We did, it might not be the best presenter way, but we're hoping that it will be meaningful content for you all. So the last teach-in kind of left off in 2000. Okay, let me know if this does, if I don't change the slide. Ended in the early aughts. And so we are picking up prior to October 7th. At the time, Gaza has been under years-long siege since 2006. It is one of the most densely populated places in the world. There's 21,000 people per square mile, and it's more densely packed than London and LA. It is also in the West Bank, the deadliest year for Palestinians. 199 people were killed in the West Bank before October 7th, and the total number of people killed was 506 just in the West Bank in 2023. And that's 3 times as many children were killed in 2023 as in 2022. So there was already an escalation before October 7th of genocidal intent. Just for some context, okay. These are the 11 months leading up to October 7th. In November 2022, Netanyahu returns to power. There is a series of pogroms in the West Bank and in Gaza. And you're seeing intense Israeli settlement expansion, with the government explicitly giving permission for Israeli settlers to take Palestinian land. July 7th is the largest raid in the West Bank in 20 years. The Jenin refugee camp is bombed, as well as the hospital there. And August 23rd, there was collective punishment for 2 shootings in Huwara and Hebron that left 3 Israelis dead, and the military launched raids on a number of Palestinian villages, injuring 112 people. So this is leading, for all the folks that say there was a ceasefire before October 7th, this is evidence that just even the 11 months before, there was violence happening. There was not peace.
So on October 7th, the Al-Aqsa Flood military operation was launched under the coordination of at least 13 Palestinian resistance groups, including the PFLP, Islamic Jihad, DFLP, and led by Hamas. Hamas has released a document clarifying the military objectives of the operation. The resistance primarily targeted military bases, followed by secondary locations in order to capture Israelis. The resistance understands that historically, the only way to release Palestinians held hostage by Israel is through prisoner exchanges. Further, due to Israel's mandatory military service, most Israelis over the age of 18 are or were soldiers. Hamas stated that due to the chaos of Al-Aqsa Flood, contributed to by the IOF's disoriented and ill-prepared response, adjustments had to be made during the operation, but that the military goals remained the same. One example of unexpected circumstances was the Nova Music Festival, which was originally scheduled to end on October 6th, but extended at the last minute to October 7th. Coming across the festival caught the resistance fighters by surprise. As a result of Al-Aqsa flood, 251 Israelis were taken captive and 1,139 Israelis were killed. Operation Al-Aqsa Flood was part of a long-standing tradition of decolonial and liberatory resistance. Historical parallels include enslaved Black people revolting against slavers, indigenous resistance in the US, and Jewish partisans resisting the Nazis. Incidentally, on October 7, 1944, the Jewish resistance led the biggest revolt ever seen at the Auschwitz extermination camp. Another parallel can be seen in how Nelson Mandela resisted South African apartheid. Mandela was also a firm supporter of Palestinian resistance, and the US officially designated Mandela a terrorist until 2008. Let's talk about the Hannibal Directive. The Hannibal Directive is an official Israeli military policy that directs the IOF to kill any Israeli taken captive by the resistance. Israel would prefer its own people to die, be they soldier or civilian, rather than exchange them for Palestinian hostages. On October 7th, the Hannibal Directive was used to kill at least over a dozen Israelis. As I said before, the Israeli response on October 7th was disoriented and ill-prepared. By October 8th, resistance fighters remained in Israeli territory and had been reinforced and resupplied, engaging with the IOF head-on and holding ground. Israel underestimated the capabilities of the resistance fighters. So we're going to talk about the Zionist military escalation, starting with the aerial bombardment of Gaza. Israel immediately responded to Al-Aqsa flood with overwhelming and disproportionate force against Gaza, launching airstrikes to level residential buildings and killing entire families within a day of October 7th. The Israeli government declared a state of war, which would allow the government to carry out, quote, significant military activities. By October 8th, Palestinians near the Gaza border were already scrambling to pack up their belongings to escape, as they understood the Israeli bombardment would be brutal and constant. Zionist airstrikes have been constant throughout the duration of the genocide. Their bombing has relentlessly and indiscriminately targeted the entirety of Gaza, often escalating at nighttime. Palestinians who already lived through 5 wars of Israeli aggression reported that this new assault on Gaza was unlike anything they had ever experienced in its scale and brutality. The airstrikes had been incessant for 10 months and played an instrumental role in forcibly transferring the vast majority of the population of northern Gaza down south toward Rafah. The airstrikes then continued in the south once Palestinians were even more tightly packed into that area. There is no part of the Gaza Strip that Israel has not continued to bomb. For the ground invasion, Israel immediately began building up forces for a ground invasion. By October 9th, 300,000 IOF reservists were called up to prepare to invade Gaza. The initial ground invasion was delayed due to Hezbollah bombing Israel in the north and Israel's need to coordinate the invasion with the United States. The full-scale ground invasion was launched on October 27th. The invasion was part of a systematic process of forcing nearly the entire population of northern Gaza south. As the IOF moved south, its soldiers continued to slaughter Palestinians with impunity, including documented cases of mass executions of men, women, and children. Bodies have been found with bullet wounds to the backs of their heads, as their hands were zip-tied behind their backs. Murdered Palestinians have been buried unceremoniously in mass graves. During the ground invasion, IOF soldiers regularly filmed themselves looting and destroying residential homes in Gaza, with the intent of making it impossible for families who survived the genocide to return.
Israel routinely bombs refugee camps filled with displaced Palestinian civilians, massacring them over and over again. This is standard practice for the IOF, as it ensures nowhere in Gaza is safe. These massacres are committed with bombs the US supplies to Israel. Men, women, and children are blown to literal pieces, as well as burned alive in their tents during these attacks. And this photo is from Motaz Aziza from the Al-Nusrat refugee camp, and this was in October. Like, I couldn't believe it was that long ago, but we see these images every day, and this was one of the Time photos of the year. Okay. Israel controls and restricts the entry of all aid into Gaza. The genocide has made the need for aid skyrocket. Before October 7th, 500 aid trucks entered Gaza per day, a number that was already not enough to meet the people's needs. And after October 7th, Israel cut the number of aid trucks down from 500 per day to only 146 per day on average. After the ICJ ruling in January that Israel must increase the flow of aid, Israel cut the numbers of trucks again down to only 105 per day. Israel allows aid to pile up without getting to Palestinians who need it, allows food to spoil, murders aid workers, and has bombed aid convoys. Israel has imposed starvation and famine or near famine conditions on the entire Gaza Strip in what experts call a targeted starvation campaign. Reports of Palestinians starving to death emerged as early as 2 weeks into the genocide. People in Gaza have been forced to resort to eating animal fodder, which is also extremely limited in supply. Israel bombed all food infrastructure, including bakeries, mills, and food stores. Israel initially imposed famine conditions on the north of Gaza, which have since spread all over the Strip. Children and the elderly have been particularly impacted by starvation. Between October 23 and July 24, Israel reportedly kidnapped over 9,500 Palestinians from the West Bank. So these kidnappings are just in the West Bank and do not include the thousands of kidnappings and illegal detentions in Gaza or those from the occupied 48 territory. This 9,500 now, which is now 2 months outdated, is far greater than the number of Palestinians released from illegal Israeli detention as a result of negotiations with Hamas during the brief pause in late November. So while the resistance has released Israeli captives in good faith, the number of Palestinian hostages taken by Israel has dramatically increased. Palestinian prisoners in Israel face horrendous conditions, including torture, rape, and limited access to food, water, electricity, healthcare, family visits, and legal assistance. Remember, as a colonized indigenous population under military occupation, every single Palestinian detained or imprisoned by their Zionist colonizers is inherently a political prisoner. The Israeli army has also continuously attacked hospitals against international law. It has been documented that the Israeli army will take dead bodies from hospitals and dig up graves, supposedly to investigate whether the bodies belong to Israeli hostages. But Euromed Human Rights Monitor has called for an independent international investigation to look into potential organ theft. Recently, Israel returned the bodies of 89 Palestinians that were in a state of complete decomposition without any ability to determine their identities. This amounts to a war crime.
So we're going to take a look at Zionist attacks on civil utilities infrastructure, starting with electrical and communication systems. By October 9th, Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant said, quote, "I ordered a full siege on the Gaza Strip. No power, no food, no gas. Everything is closed. We are fighting human animals and we act accordingly." Gaza had already been under full siege for 16 years, and Al-Aqsa flood was the first time the Palestinians broke that siege, so Israel's punishment was harsh. Israel cut off electricity and communication systems, which made it much harder for Palestinians to communicate with each other, as well as with the outside world. These rolling blackouts therefore served a dual purpose of further incapacitating life inside of Gaza, as well as attempting to prevent the world from seeing the carnage that Israel was inflicting. It allowed Israel to act under cover of darkness, both literally and metaphorically. Israel has also systematically destroyed Palestinians' access to water, as well as infrastructure to treat water. This means the little water Palestinians receive, less than a toilet flush worth per day on average, is not sanitary and often unsuitable for safely drinking. Aid infrastructure. UNRWA is the primary UN agency that provides aid relief for Palestinian refugees. Prior to October, UNRWA operated 700 schools and 140 health centers in the Gaza Strip. As a UN agency, it receives its funding from countries around the world. UNRWA is the most vital aid agency in Gaza. As part of the genocide, Israel determined it needed to remove Palestinians' access to this aid. In January, Israel accused 12 UNRWA staff members, or 0.1% of its 30,000 total staff, of participating in Al-Aqsa flood. In response, the UNRWA Commissioner General fired employees without investigation. Immediately following the accusations, at least 18 countries, including the United States, Germany, and United Kingdom, froze funding to UNRWA totaling almost $1 billion. This had immediate devastating consequences for Palestinians in Gaza. Please note that it is also irrelevant if any UNRWA workers do have any connections to the resistance. Cutting off aid is an unambiguous act of genocide. As of today, the United States, formerly UNRWA's biggest contributor by far, is the only country that has not resumed funding to UNRWA. The US has put a ban on funding until at least March 2025. In addition to conspiring to cut UNRWA funding, Israel has also bombed multiple UNRWA aid centers and warehouses, killing aid workers and destroying aid meant to be distributed to Palestinians. Healthcare infrastructure. In a matter of days following October 7th, Gaza's hospitals were completely overwhelmed by the unprecedented influx of civilian casualties. Israel targeted ambulances with bombs and also blocked roads to prevent ambulances from reaching patients and hospitals. On October 14th, Al Ali Hospital's Cancer Treatment Center was damaged by IOF airstrikes. On October 15th, the World Health Organization reported that 4 Gaza hospitals were no longer functioning following Israeli airstrikes. World Health Organization called Israel's evacuation orders death sentences for hospital patients. On October 16th, Doctors Without Borders reported that surgeons in Gaza hospitals were forced to operate on patients without painkillers. This soon included performing amputations on wounded civilians and C-sections on pregnant women without anesthesia. On October 17th, Israel bombed the Al Ali hospital, killing hundreds. At the time, Israel denied the attack, with Israeli propagandists stating that Israel would not directly bomb a hospital. Since then, it has repeatedly bombed every hospital in Gaza. On October 18th, the United States vetoed a UN resolution urging humanitarian aid into Gaza. On October 19th, Israeli airstrikes targeted Al-Quds Hospital, and the Red Cross stated that Gaza's entire health system was, quote, on its knees. On October 21st, Medical Aid for Palestinians and UNICEF warned about the imminent deaths of 130 premature babies if fuel was not provided to hospitals. By October 23rd, hospitals in Gaza began to shut down due to Israel cutting off access to fuel. The Gaza Health Ministry stated the healthcare system had totally collapsed and reported the murder of 65 medics and destruction of 25 ambulances by IOF bombs. On October 28th, a communications blackout meant that injured civilians could no longer call for the limited emergency medical services that remained. On October 30th, the World Health Organization announced it could no longer resupply Gaza hospitals due to the safety risk caused by Israel bombing the hospitals. The total collapse in Israel's healthcare infrastructure all happened by the end of October, in the first 2 weeks of the genocide. It is now 10 months later. In that time, healthcare in Gaza has been beyond obliterated. Conditions in Gaza are so deteriorated that patients have maggots in their wounds. Israel uses weapons on civilians that would be extremely difficult to treat, even in the most ideal circumstances, including white phosphorus burns and bombs designed to shred people's bodies to pieces. On November 10th, the IOF stormed Al-Nasser Hospital and forced the staff to evacuate with patients who could be moved. At the time, a number of premature newborn infants were on ventilators in the neonatal intensive care unit. According to a doctor who worked there, the IOF stated that it would coordinate with an international team to transfer those babies to another hospital. Weeks later, when Palestinian and other healthcare workers were finally able to return to the hospital, they discovered that Israel left those babies in their beds to die. Their bodies were decomposing by the time they were found. In the last 10 months, the attacks on healthcare workers have been overwhelming. Many doctors and nurses in Gaza have bravely refused IOF evacuation orders and remained behind to treat their patients as best they could, often being killed or injured in the process. Israel has stormed and besieged dozens of hospitals, systematically tearing through them as part of the ground invasion and massacring patients and those seeking shelter along the way. It is also common practice for Israel to bomb a residential building, then wait for emergency medical responders to arrive before bombing the location again. Disease is now rampant in Gaza. Polio is back. COVID, hepatitis, skin infections and diseases, some of which are so rare that doctors struggle to identify them, let alone treat them. UNICEF reported that between October and January, at least 1,000 children had one or both legs amputated. Injuries and amputations are prone to infection because ongoing treatment is virtually impossible. Doctors Without Borders reported that the majority of amputations would not have been necessary if proper treatment was available. Experts say Gaza has the largest cohort of pediatric amputees in history. On January 29th, 6-year-old Hind Rajab and 6 of her family members were fleeing their neighborhood when an IOF tank shot their car. Hind's aunt, uncle, and cousins were killed. Hind and her 15-year-old cousin, Layan, were injured but still alive. Layan was able to call the Palestinian Red Crescent Society to ask for emergency aid. The Israeli soldiers continued to shoot at them during the call. Emergency dispatchers heard Layan screaming until she was killed by machine gun fire. When the dispatchers called back, 6-year-old Hind answered the phone. She told the dispatchers that the rest of her family was dead and that the tank was continuing to approach the car. Dispatchers told Hind to keep hiding in the vehicle and stayed on the phone with her for 3 hours. Hind told them, "I'm so scared, please come take me, please will you come?" The PRCS dispatched an ambulance to the location to rescue her. En route, the ambulance reported being targeted by the Israeli military, and after sounds of gunfire and an explosion, contact with the ambulance was lost. 12 days later, the IOF had moved on to a new location, and Palestinian residents of the neighborhood were finally able to return home. They discovered the car that Hind was in. She had been killed along with the rest of her family. The windows were blown out of their car, and it was riddled with hundreds of bullet holes. A few feet away from the car was the Red Crescent ambulance, which had also been completely destroyed, and the 2 ambulance workers inside were killed. Israel tortured 6-year-old Hind Rajab for hours, shooting at her, terrorizing her, forcing her to hide among her family's bodies. They brutally murdered her, and they used her as bait to lure 2 heroic medical workers to their deaths.
So all of these things that we've tried to separate are really all connected. Brian just mentioned infrastructure and military and psychological. All of these are escalations in all the areas at the same time. So this is some of the psychological ways that the Israeli military has escalated to genocide. A death march is a forced transfer of a population in which a group is forced to mass migrate under threat of death and destruction. One intention of death marches is to thin out a population as the exhausting effort is too much for many people to handle, particularly the elderly, infirmed, and children. Famous examples of death marches include the Trail of Tears, the forced movement of indigenous folks west on Turtle Island, the forced marches of enslaved Africans, and the Nazis forcing Jews to march from concentration camps to other locations, killing many along their routes. In Gaza, the constant forced relocations amount to death marches. Palestinians are forced to march for miles in the heat, through the rubble, and while dehydrated and malnourished, to new locations miles away in other parts of the Gaza Strip. Then, before they can even settle in these new locations, they are frequently evacuated again and forced to march for miles to a new location, or even back to where they started from. Another part of the death marches is the dropping of pamphlets. Israel engages in this practice by dropping thousands of leaflets over neighborhoods and refugee camps in Gaza to send messages to the Palestinians living there. The best known purpose of these leaflets is to instruct Palestinians to evacuate, often with only an hour's notice or less, before that area is bombed by the IOF. Israel claims that these pamphlets are evidence of Israel going out of its way to protect Palestinians and be humanitarian. But in reality, these pamphlets are a form of psychological torture designed to break the bodies and spirits of the Palestinians. They are given virtually no time to pack up their entire lives before their homes are bombed into rubble. They face obvious psychological and emotional distress knowing bombs are coming. Additionally, Israel often lies about the time and location of these strikes so that when Palestinians evacuate en masse, Israel bombs the crowded evacuation route instead. Another form of psychological torture is the use of buzzing drones. Israel flies surveillance drones over Palestinian neighborhoods and refugee camps day and night. These drones emit a constant buzzing noise which prevent Palestinians from sleeping and impose a never-ending threatening presence over their lives. The buzzing sound is both a disruption and a threat and is designed to increase paranoia, stress, exhaustion, and fear. And this map just shows the evacuation orders from December to January, like the multiple times people were moved, but we had trouble even finding a map that showed all the movements because I think there's just been so many that it's been like leave the north and then further south and then go back north. So this was what we could find for now, but there, I'm sure will be at some point a map of like all the places that people have been just displaced up and down the strip.
Sexual assault has been weaponized against Palestinians since the beginning of Zionist colonization. In the current genocide in Gaza, a trend has emerged where IOF soldiers filmed and photographed themselves digging through the belongings of Palestinians whose homes they invaded, holding up lingerie and other personal items of the women living there. The United Nations has reported that there have been extensive allegations and documented incidents of sexual assault against Palestinian girls, boys, women, and men at the hands of the IOF. These assaults include degradation, invasive strip searches, humiliation, forcing Palestinians to kiss the Israeli flag, sexual torture, sexual assault in front of family members, genital electrocution, threats of rape, and rape by both male and female IOF soldiers. These assaults take place not only in prisons and IOF concentration camps, but also within Gaza itself as part of the ground invasion. In late July, a Palestinian man held prisoner at the Sderot Taman torture camp was hospitalized with a ruptured bowel, severe injury to his anus, lung damage, and broken ribs. A few days later, another Palestinian man released from the camp reported widespread sexual abuse and rape as a routine form of torture, stating that most of the prisoners released leave with rectal injuries due to sexual assault by the IOF. On August 5th, B'Tselem and British newspaper The Guardian each released detailed reports on the systemic use of rape in Israeli prisons, including rapes using hot metal sticks and electrified sticks. Palestinian prisoners also reported that IOF soldiers take videos of the rapes on their phones. On August 6th, surveillance footage from the Sderot Taman camp was leaked showing Israeli soldiers gang raping a Palestinian prisoner with a metal rod. It should be noted that when this footage was leaked, Israeli Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich called for a criminal investigation, not into the rape, but into the source of the leak so that whoever damaged Israel's international reputation could be punished. It should also be noted that reports of rape and sexual assault by the IOF are extensively documented through the entirety of occupied Palestine, not just in Gaza.
Another component of the genocide is the Israel trying to kill off Palestinian culture, and that starts with journalists. They kill journalists to kill the story. Since Israel has blocked foreign media from entering Gaza, Palestinian journalists in the territory are the only ones documenting the war on the ground. The IOF is not differentiating between the political and military wings of Hamas, so they're allowing targeting of journalists that may work for Hamas-run media. There's also an idea among US and other Western media that Gaza is a journalistic black hole, a mysterious land that like reporters are cut off from, which is not true. It's true that journalists from outside of Gaza are not allowed inside. They've only entered on the back of Israeli tanks. But this belief of there being no journalism erases the many Palestinian journalists inside Gaza who have been working under brutal circumstances for the past 3 months. A study over 3 months of 4 of the biggest news shows in the US finds that only 1 question has been asked by US media about the killing of journalists. And I just saw, as I was getting here that Bisan, their 150 celebrities just signed a letter for her not to be eligible for like an Emmy, or she's nominated for an award, and they don't think that she should receive an award. So it's like they're attacking journalists to suffocate the story. Another attack on culture is the attack on educational structures. Israel has committed what UN experts call a systemic obliteration of the education system in Gaza. It has been called a scholasticide, with a total destruction of Gaza's educational infrastructure. By mid-August, Israel has bombed at least 564 schools in Gaza since October, a number which amounts to about 85% of the total number of schools in the Gaza Strip. In that time, there has also been a steady but massive increase in the number of schools directly targeted with Israeli bombs compared to the number of schools damaged by indirect bombings. This increase corresponds to the increasingly common use of schools as shelter for displaced Palestinians, demonstrating Israel's deliberate targeting of the most vulnerable in Gaza. The vast majority of the schools bombed will require full reconstruction or major rehabilitation to ever be functional again. Not only has the genocide interrupted the immediate education of every child and student in Gaza, it has also eroded the foundation for sustained societal growth and development. In other words, Israel's attack on education and educational infrastructure is a deliberate attempt to not only destroy Palestinian society today, but also to prevent Palestinian society from being rebuilt in the future. And this graph shows like the severe escalation of direct hits to schools that has occurred.
And the escalation there, the direct bombings of schools corresponds with the number of people taking shelter in schools, because other places of shelter have been destroyed. So the more they hide in schools, the more the schools get bombed.
There's also been an attack on religion. 700 mosques and 3 churches had been destroyed as of mid-July this year. This is an image of the Great Omari Mosque. This is 2017, and this is 2023. This mosque is the oldest mosque in Gaza. So it's another example of the total obliteration of culture that Zionists are attempting to achieve.
So we are going to take a look at how Israeli and US military aggression has spread violence in the region, and also responses from what's being called the axis of resistance. Starting with the Yemen Red Sea blockade. Ansar Allah, often called the Houthis, began launching missiles at Israel on October 19th in response to the genocide. Because of Yemen's strategic position on the Red Sea, they also have engaged in a bold blockade of the Red Sea in an attempt to prevent ships from reaching Israel, as well as dealing major economic damage to Israel. They target any ship associated with Israel, and in response have suffered significant airstrikes launched by the United States and United Kingdom. However, this has not deterred them, and it is all the more impressive because in recent years, Yemen itself was suffering under a US-backed Saudi blockade and bombing, where famine conditions were imposed on Yemen, and yet they still have more nerve and courage to stand up to Israel than most countries in the world. Moving north, on the morning of October 8th, Hezbollah in southern Lebanon fired rockets at Israeli military targets in northern occupied Palestine, including on land that is historically Lebanese territory occupied by Israel since 1967. There had been a long-standing escalation bubbling up prior to this, and Hezbollah said it would not remain neutral in the battle against Israeli occupation. Israeli aggression has drastically escalated confrontations with Hezbollah in the time since, with the IOF using illegal white phosphorus weapons against civilians in Lebanon and bombing neighborhoods in Beirut. Military responses from Hezbollah contributed to delaying the ground invasion of Gaza, as the IOF needed to direct some of its attention and resources northward. Hezbollah has also caused tens of thousands of Israeli settlers illegally occupying the north to evacuate further south into occupied Palestine. Israel frequently bombs targets in Syria, including in Damascus and Aleppo. Israel regularly bombs airports in these locations. On April 1st, Israel bombed the Iranian embassy complex in Damascus, another major escalation against both Iran and Syria. Since November, the Islamic resistance in Iraq has launched drone and missile attacks against Israel in retaliation for the genocide. It is also participating in a maritime blockade in an effort to disable Israeli ports. Iran. Iran is a key player in coordinating the axis of resistance. In response to the bombing of its embassy complex in Damascus, it launched what were effectively warning missiles toward Israel in what was widely considered a very restrained response. In April, Israel launched airstrikes against Iran, but these were widely considered to be almost symbolic and didn't escalate much. However, on July 31st, Israel assassinated Hamas political leader Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran. This was considered a massive escalation. Iran and the rest of the axis of resistance have since promised a significant response, but we have yet to see what that will look like. And we need to talk about material support from the United States and other countries. The United States is the primary and by far most significant sponsor of Zionist aggression. Without political, financial, and military support from the United States, Israel would crumble. Israel's existence plays a key role in US imperial interests in the region and the world. On October 8th, the US sent the USS Gerald Ford, the world's largest aircraft carrier, to the Eastern Mediterranean Sea, along with warplanes, cruisers, destroyers, and 5,000 sailors ready to provide military support to Israel. Support for Israel in the US government is bipartisan and ironclad. The United States immediately condemned Al-Aqsa flood and promised to support Israel in its retaliation. Between October 7th and today, the United States enacted legislation and cut deals providing Israel with tens of billions of dollars in military aid. The US places no restrictions on this aid and has no red lines that Israel could cross to cut it off, in violation of both international law and US foreign policy. If it was not for the United States, Israel would have run out of bombs months ago. It is our tax dollars funding this genocide. The United States also assists Israel militarily by providing surveillance and intelligence that assists Israeli military operations. The US also provides Israel with economic, political, and diplomatic protection and support. Domestically, including here in Pennsylvania, the US has anti-BDS laws that make it illegal for Americans to engage in BDS, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions strategy for cutting off economic support for Israel. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu received a bipartisan invitation to address the US Congress, which he did on July 24th to thunderous applause for his genocidal rhetoric. Internationally, the US pretends to be a neutral third party in negotiations for peace, while helping Israel sabotage negotiations every step of the way. At the United Nations, the US has vetoed 3 separate attempts at passing a ceasefire resolution, unilaterally shutting down the demands of the international community for Israel to end its assault on Gaza. Most recently, Kamala Harris reiterated her steadfast support for Israel, its right to continue the genocide, and that she will not stop sending weapons to Israel. This only scratches the surface of US involvement. There could be an entire teach-in series on this topic. So for this teach-in's purposes, the key thing to remember is that the genocide is being committed by the United States as much as it is being committed by Israel. Other countries implicated in military, financial, and political support of the genocide include the UK, the European Union, including member states France and Italy, and Germany, the country that committed the Holocaust, which is the second largest provider of military aid to Israel behind the United States. In practice, the majority of the Western world and US allies bear varying degrees of responsibility for supporting the genocide. And now we are going to talk about propaganda as a tool for genocide, starting with 40 beheaded babies.
This is Israeli propaganda.
Israeli propaganda, yes. The lie that the Palestinian resistance fighters beheaded 40 babies is both one of the widest spread and easily disproved pieces of propaganda used to justify the genocide. On October 10th, an American news reporter in Israel interviewed an IOF soldier who claimed to have removed 40 dead babies from a kibbutz. It was quickly revealed this soldier was a liar and longtime anti-Palestinian racist, and his claim was totally discredited. But not before a second journalist claimed those non-existent babies were beheaded. That second journalist quickly retracted her lie and stated it was false, but not before the story spread around the world. The IOF, which initially denied the story, saw that the lie was causing people to support brutal retaliation, so they changed their denials to no comment. Then Joe Biden went on TV and told the world that he saw pictures of the resistance beheading babies. This claim caused the already viral hoax to explode, putting it on the front page of newspapers around the world and spreading it to an audience of millions, if not billions. Shortly after, officials from the Biden administration clarified that Biden had lied and did not, in fact, see any such photos. This retraction, of course, went virtually unnoticed in comparison to the lie, and the damage was done. Just as was the case with WMDs in Iraq, lies about Vietnam, Afghanistan, Libya, and so many other places, the propaganda accomplished its intended purpose of manufacturing consent for ruthless collective punishment and genocide, which then brings us to claims of mass sexual assault. Immediately following October 7th, Zionists began to spread unsubstantiated rumors that resistance fighters committed mass sexual assault against Israelis. From the outset, this propaganda was designed to invoke classically racist tropes of hordes of brown savages violating pure Western European women, thereby inspiring racist Westerners, particularly white people, to believe that the Palestinians are animals who deserved whatever Israel did in retaliation. Unfortunately, despite being an outright lie, this propaganda has stuck and continues to be used to justify the genocide. In late December, the New York Times published an article dramatically titled "Screams Without Words: How Hamas Weaponized Sexual Violence on October 7th." Right off the bat, this article had gaping holes in it. Contradictory claims from a key witness, public comments from family members of alleged victims who said the New York Times misled them about the story, a total lack of physical and forensic evidence, a lack of any victims willing to come forward publicly or privately, and a reliance on multiple witnesses who have been repeatedly shown to have lied about October 7th, even prior to being interviewed for the New York Times article. The New York Times article was explosive, graphic, and treated by the mainstream media as conclusive evidence that Hamas engaged in brutal and systematic sexual assault on October 7th. However, an investigation by The Intercept revealed that the primary author of the New York Times piece, Anat Schwartz, an Israeli filmmaker with no prior journalistic experience, had a history of liking racist comments against Palestinians on social media, including a call to, quote, turn Gaza into a slaughterhouse. Furthermore, in an Israeli radio interview, Schwartz admitted that she found, quote, found no direct evidence of rapes or sexual violence. Schwartz indicated that the story was decided on ahead of time and that her job was to fill in the blanks. This is, of course, in direct contradiction with the actual purpose of journalism in finding the truth and building the story from there. The New York Times article was so poorly vetted and uncorroborated that even the New York Times' own staff dissented. The producers of the New York Times daily news podcast, The Daily, were unwilling to cover their own paper's story due to its unreliable reporting. Rather than retract the story, the New York Times launched an investigation of its own employees, questioning over 24 of them to determine how this information was leaked to The Intercept. Anat Schwartz was ultimately fired from the New York Times, but the paper has not retracted the article. Other documented examples of Israel's pro-genocide propaganda include showing sympathetic journalists, celebrities, and influencers select footage of October 7th to maintain the outrage, giving carefully curated tours of October 7th sites in an attempt to cling on to that justification for genocide for as long as possible, and spreading debunked lies, including babies baked in ovens, fabricated phone calls supposedly of resistance fighters, planting evidence all over Gaza in an attempt to make the entire population, including children, look guilty of terrorism and releasing footage of Palestinians supposedly confessing to crimes against Israel, despite these so-called confessions being made under conditions of torture in a clear violation of international law. This is a very brief overview for time, but again, all of these propaganda attempts have been debunked. Israel also weaponizes the identity of captives for propaganda purposes. It calls many of the captives women and girls to appeal to racist tropes of brown savages harming women, despite the fact that those captives are soldiers and legitimate military targets. Israel also invokes physical characteristics of some captives, including red hair, blue eyes, and a general appeal to Westerners' understanding of and sympathy toward whiteness and its supposed purity, much in the same way the Nazis invoked blonde hair and blue eyes. Israel is banking on the white supremacy of the West to bolster support for the genocide.
It's also important to remember that the intent of genocide is not just among the IOF, it is widespread throughout Israeli society. So Zionist Israelis don't have to be active members of the IOF to materially participate in the genocide. Israeli settlers block the crossings for humanitarian aid trucks to enter Gaza because, according to Order 9, one of the organizing groups of these blockades, Israel gives gifts to Hamas and the possibility of total control over the Gaza Strip through ownerships of the distribution of aid. Protesters loot and set fire to aid trucks, and the delay in delivery of aid leads to the aid being spoiled as well. The US has sanctioned some of these extremist groups that organize this, but they have not held the Israeli government accountable for its complicity in not protecting the aid trucks. There's also been an escalation of settler aggression in the West Bank, where there are fears that the West Bank will undergo a genocide as Gaza is. There's been a massive settlement expansion since October. Pogroms against Palestinians at the hands of Zionist settlers are a daily occurrence. Palestinians are killed, homes and land burned, and populations displaced. In the US and Canada, property sales for land and homes in the West Bank have been held at local synagogues. Palestinians in the West Bank have faced devastating economic consequences during this time, and unemployment has rose dramatically. Zionist settlers also have participated in storming the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. Those attacks have escalated in severity. There have been pro-rape protests in Israel that are supporting, their protests that support the IOF soldiers that have committed rape of Palestinians. And some Israeli government officials have condemned the pro-rape protests, not because of their content, but explicitly because they felt the protests hurt Israel's international reputation. And other Israeli government officials have praised the IOF soldiers, openly proclaiming them heroes and explicitly stating that it is okay for them to rape or do anything else to Palestinians as they please. This propaganda has also been used as a tool for violence abroad. Something to note before we talk about this is in 101, we talk about how this is not a religious war. It is critical to understand that people who appear to be Arab are often presumed to be Muslim and are being targeted by hateful acts as a result, when in fact their identity and religiosity may differ. So for this reason, anti-Muslim and anti-Arab racism are often difficult to disentangle. So this is from CARE, the Center for American and Islamic Relations. They have received the highest number of complaints ever in their 30-year history. And off the back of these, this racism, there have been actual attacks on people who may appear Arab, Muslim. The one that I'm not going to go, we don't have time to go through all of them, but the one to note is that this actually happened in Harrisburg on October 13th. A white man shouted slurs and pulled a gun on Palestinian protesters right here in Harrisburg. It's worth noting that the man served for 20 years in the same US military that provides unconditional support for Israel and has devastated the rest of the Middle East. So these aren't things that are happening other places. This is coming into our local communities as well.
So let's talk about resistance. The resistance has deployed an incredibly effective guerrilla warfare campaign against the IOF. An elaborate system of underground tunnels and the home field advantage of knowing the terrain allows resistance fighters to confront IOF soldiers and even tanks head-on on their own terms, choosing when and where to engage. They are also able to lure the IOF into a variety of traps and ambushes. This bold strategy of direct confrontation places the resistance between the IOF and Palestinian civilians and protects Palestinian civilians by giving them more time to escape being murdered by the IOF. Palestinians in the West Bank and the rest of occupied Palestine also resist by taking up arms, labor strikes, and mass protests. International law will not liberate Palestine, or anyone else for that matter, but the resistance has used international law to build support globally. Hamas has consistently called for international law to be enforced and for independent investigations into October 7th and the subsequent genocide. Israel has sabotaged all efforts for such investigations. Hamas also attempted to release several captives for medical reasons because Israel bombed the healthcare infrastructure and they couldn't take care of them, but Israel refused to accept those captives, leaving them in Gaza. Israel and the United States have consistently sabotaged ceasefire efforts in order to buy Israel more time for genocide. Israel has repeatedly stated it will not end the genocide even if a hostage deal is reached. The Biden-Harris administration also co-opted the word ceasefire, redefining it to mean a temporary pause, which in practice means continued genocide. The US also gave Israel cover after it assassinated Ismail Haniyeh, the lead Palestinian negotiator for a ceasefire. In short, the US has taken no meaningful steps to end the genocide. On the contrary, the United States has only worked to continue the genocide. In July, 14 Palestinian factions met in Beijing and signed a declaration on ending division and strengthening Palestinian unity for national liberation. Meanwhile, Israel is deeply divided. While the entirety of Israel is committed to Zionism and is thus inherently genocidal, the state is split between moderates who want to take precautions to save Israel's international reputation and support, and thereby save Zionism, and more overtly fascist hardliners who are more suicidally adamant about escalating the genocide to a more accelerated pace. Those are the ones who dominate Israeli society. Israel has seen large protests against the government for not bringing the captives home. The Israeli captives are their concern here, not the actual genocide. And Israel has suffered massive economic losses due primarily to resistance efforts. Genocide is economically and socially unsustainable, and Israel creates the material conditions for its own downfall. So to move into the global Intifada. The Palestinian liberation movement is popular worldwide. Even in countries where the government supports Israel, the people support Palestine. Millions upon millions of people have taken to the streets. University students have occupied their campuses calling for divestment. Weapons manufacturers and ports providing weapons and materials to Israel have been shut down. And all of these actions have been met with state violence and suppression. At least 11 countries have recalled their ambassadors from Israel or cut ties with Israel altogether. By March, over 100 cities and municipalities in the US passed resolutions calling for a ceasefire and end to the genocide. We tried to pass one in Harrisburg, but the process was sabotaged behind the scenes by the mayor's office and her collaboration with local Zionists. The global Intifada has been a masterclass in solidarity between colonized and oppressed peoples. The movement to liberate Palestine has mobilized so many forces to come together in a united front to combat imperialist oppression, advancing the fights for Black and Indigenous liberation here in the US, liberation in Sudan, Congo, Haiti, Korea, Bangladesh, and elsewhere, revitalizing Jewish anti-Zionism. In short, demonstrating to the white supremacist capitalist class that we have what it takes to come together and free us all. Therefore, it is unsurprising that we are currently experiencing extensive efforts by the state to sow division between these different groups in an attempt to make us forget that we are in this together and that none of us is free until all of us are free. This is similar to how the feds used COINTELPRO and other operations to divide and sabotage the Black liberation, anti-war, and civil rights movements in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. It is on us to collectively reject the division and build on our momentum.
So everything that we've described today is, this is a textbook case of an ongoing genocide. Statements from Israeli officials demonstrate an intent to commit genocide. Analysis by genocide scholars names what is occurring as a genocide. The South Africa International Court of Justice case has led to the ICJ ruling that it is plausible Israel is committing genocide, which means the case will be allowed to continue. In the meantime, the ICJ issued a series of provisional rulings to prevent genocide from escalating, although Israel has openly defied all of these rulings. And this is a map of the countries that support the South Africa in the genocide case. And so the blue countries, or like tealish countries, are the ones that support it. And you can see, just as Brian was noting, that there's solidarity across the global South for South Africa and their case of genocide against Israel. And then Western, or the global North, you're seeing the support of Israel in opposition to the ICJ case. So that solidarity is evident even on the map. These are the current numbers in Gaza as of mid-July. But I don't want to linger on this slide, because something to point out is that the reported casualties are, because of the destruction of the infrastructure, the casualties are not being reported or recorded properly because, well, like I just said, they deliberately have destroyed the infrastructure. So you can see, so from October to January, that's 3 months, there were 32,000 people reported killed. And then you can see it just gets smaller and smaller. Between April and May, it's saying that only 100 people were killed, and we all saw on our phones more than that. That's not accurate. And so you can see that somehow from January to July, 6 months, it's saying there's only been 14,000 deaths, which is just not true. And that's why the Lancet report, which was released in July, in the medical journal, the Lancet, they noted that armed conflicts have indirect health implications beyond the direct harm from violence. So even if a conflict ends immediately, there will continue to be many indirect deaths in the coming months and years from causes such as reproductive, communicable, and non-communicable diseases. The Lancet report article applies a conservative estimate of 4 indirect deaths per 1 direct death. So if there's 30, they use the number 37,396 deaths because that's what it was at the time of the article. It's not implausible to estimate that up to 186,000 people or even more could die, and those deaths could be attributed to the current genocide in Gaza. So if the genocide ended, well, a month ago, they're saying that 186,000 conservatively will have been killed directly or indirectly by the genocide. So the longer it goes on, there's just an exponential increase of deaths. And this is actually a discussion that we've had within HBC of what to put on our info flyers, is like how do we count how many people have been killed? And every number is a person with a family. As we noted at the beginning, it's not just a number. June 19th was the Lancet report. Okay, thank you. June 19th, Zoom friends. So what can we do? We have a bunch of things that you can do. The first is the Abu Raida family. HPC is supporting directly their GoFundMe. The QR code's here and on the table over there if you'd like to make a direct donation. Save the dates. September 29th, there will be a 5K for Heal Palestine here in Harrisburg. Heal
22nd.
It's the 22nd.
22nd.
22nd. Heal Palestine is an organization that does a lot of work in supporting Palestinians on the ground in Gaza. And then October 5th, there will be a mass action in Harrisburg. So save those dates. Pay attention to the Stand with Israel Act that has passed the PA State Senate. HPC is watching that closely. So follow our Instagram for call to actions for that. Hopefully it doesn't go anywhere and it dies in the House, and learn more about the BDS movement and ways to ensure that your money is not supporting genocidal Zionism. We recommend to learn more to follow journalists in Gaza, and our narrative, Al-Aqsa Flood, is Hamas's statement on what happened on October 7th. So that will counter some of the narratives that you're hearing out there. And then we have two resources that we're trying to get into schools. They are both free, the Padlet, and then Estee Inc. is, there's a full course that's available that you can go through that's really well designed that we're trying to get into schools. And lastly, for all of you that have been here all summer with us, we have raised enough money to sponsor 130 books. You know, those books I'm always holding up. For this will go towards Layers of Black History, which Corey, would you like to say anything about Layers of Black History? Would you like to tell folks about it?
Yeah. Stand up. First and foremost, thank you all for your work. Thank you all for just relentless, as you should be, and prominent, visible. So my name is Corey Dupree. I'm the founder of Layers of Black History. We focus on getting diverse books that are written by Black and Brown and diverse authors and highlighting stories. And we host curated events, not just here, but pretty much up and down the Northeast. So it's been a lot of dividing and conquering for my team, working from Cambridge, Massachusetts. But I went to McPherson School High School, Penn State. My kids and I live locally in Palmyra. And this is the birth child of racist incident that I go and deal with my kids in Palmyra. We were at the park, and 5 and 3 years old was the first time that they were called racial slurs, and we were called niggers while we were walking to the park. So it was my kids, right? One of them was our neighbor. So I'm all about action, and action for me, unfortunately, has caused me to miss most of the sessions because I'm all over the place. But this is why I do the work. And when Amy and I met, I was vending, I believe, at Hershey Arts Fest, and it was a no-brainer to go ahead and collaborate because these are the stories that we build the narratives that are out there are completely biased, completely true. So the best way to go ahead and break that system like this is to grow up. So I wholeheartedly believe that. So not only will these books go through Central Pennsylvania, but in the past 3 years, we started February 2. Over 6,000 books have been donated across the country, and my brothers and I were just up in Boston, betting at an event. We'll be getting books to Kenya for a new school that was built there. So it's extremely important that books related to all genocides are now going from Sudan, Haiti, Palestine, that these voices are magnified and stories are told, because of beautiful stories, and beautiful people, and beautiful history, and what's hopefully going to be a beautiful future. And we always have to do all of our parts to provide that education. And it starts with the parent reading with their child, or with the child reading to their parents. So that's where these books are going to go. Extremely grateful and thankful for all of you all work that you all do this summer. We just have to go ahead and apologize to us because it's easy to go ahead and be quiet, right? And know that what's going on. It's hard to go ahead and be bold to share with your retribution at work or family, all the different things you talk about, right? So we just have to keep doing work. And thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you. So thank you to everybody that's come all summer to join us. Thank you for the people that led sessions, for the people that are here. every other week with us. We hope to offer more sessions and different sessions. These are all on YouTube. If you'd like to share them with friends, family, promote them. They are all up there. So yeah, I don't know what they have time. Did you want to do?
I just want to add, we're also going to be giving these as well as Patrick Moore and Lynn Pastor and York and all presenters to this. So follow up.
Thank you so much for coming. Thank you for bearing with us. We know that that was a lot. Yeah. So thank you for being with us through that. And we hope to see all of you soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.